Thank you sincerely for joining Pillowtime Whispers. My channel always brings you the most fascinating and haunting stories. Today, we continue with the Creepypasta series, stories originating from the West that deliver an uncanny sense of fear. This time, I'll bring you the tale of a young man's graveyard watch, a chilling experience of mysterious creatures and unspeakable secrets in a cemetery. Let's delve into this eerie narrative together. I graduated from high school in the spring of 2003 and was awarded a scholarship to a local community college. I decided to find a summer job to earn some extra money before starting my freshman year in the fall. At that time, a friend of my dad, who worked as a caretaker at a local cemetery, was taking a leave of absence for a few months to prepare for a scheduled back surgery. Dad's friend mentioned that his son, Brian, who was about my age, had volunteered to take the morning shift at the cemetery. He then asked if I'd be interested in a nighttime position. When I asked what that entailed, he explained it was a night watchman job. Apparently, several cemeteries in the area had been vandalized, likely by local teens, and they needed someone to guard the grounds from 8 p.m. when the cemetery closed to 5 a.m. when Brian arrived for the morning shift. He clarified that the position wasn't officially sanctioned by the county, but he was willing to pay me out of his own pocket. At first, I hesitated to take the job. I'm not easily scared, but the thought of spending 9 hours alone in an isolated cemetery was unnerving. However, I had no other job lined up for the summer, and the pay was better than flipping burgers at McDonald's. So I shrugged and said, "Sure, why not?" The cemetery where I worked was located on the outskirts of the small rural town where I was born. It was surrounded by farmland on 3 sides, with a small forest bordering its rear. The cemetery itself was quite large, about 6 acres, and one of the oldest in the region, with tombstones dating back to the early 1800s. I drove to the cemetery on a warm early summer evening for my first shift and was greeted by my dad's friend near the entrance. He spent the next hour giving me a tour of the grounds and explaining my duties. Essentially, I was to conduct hourly patrols of the cemetery, noting any unusual activity. If I encountered anyone trespassing, I was not to confront them but to contact the police instead. He then took me to a small shed near the main gate, stocked with gardening tools and equipment. Inside, there was a small desk with a chair, a logbook for my reports, and a large flashlight requiring 4 D-cell batteries. After the tour, his demeanor turned serious. He told me there was one more thing I needed to see and pulled a set of keys from his pocket. I watched curiously as he unlocked a steel cabinet against the wall. When he opened it, I drew a sharp breath. Inside was a pump-action 12-gauge shotgun and a box of shells. He kept the cabinet open for a few seconds to let me get a good look before closing and locking it again. He explained that the shotgun was for extreme emergencies only and that he didn't want me touching it unless my life was in imminent danger. He went on to say that you never know who might show up at a cemetery after dark. Often, it's harmless. A bunch of bored kids looking for a place to drink or goof around. But cemeteries are also known to attract eccentrics, occult practitioners, drug users, and, on rare occasions, grave robbers. Seeing the unease on my face, he gave me a reassuring smile and said it was very rare to encounter the kind of people he had described while on the job. Still, he wanted me to know about the shotgun just in case. Then, he removed the cabinet key from the keyring and handed it to me. By then, it was late afternoon, with the shadows of night creeping in as the sun began to set. After showing and explaining everything I needed to know, we shook hands, and he left. I watched as he got into his pickup truck, drove through the cemetery gates, and disappeared onto the main road, out of sight. It hit me all at once. I was alone in a desolate cemetery, miles from anywhere, and the darkness was closing in. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at my watch and realized it was almost 8 p.m., time to begin my first shift. I figured I had about an hour of daylight left. For my initial patrol, I started at the newer section of the cemetery in the front and worked my way to the older section on the side. That part of the cemetery was especially eerie. There were cracked and leaning gravestones weathered by the elements, and some even appeared sunken. Earlier, during the tour, The caretaker had explained that this happened because the soil above old wooden coffins eventually collapsed as the wood rotted away. The thought sent another shiver through me. The rear of the cemetery ended at a steep embankment that sloped down to a creek, bordered by a small forest on the other side. At the bottom of the embankment lay a pile of dried wreaths and flowers from various graves. I assumed the caretaker had left them there after they had wilted and decomposed. The entire patrol took only 15 minutes, so I returned to the shed to kill time until the next round. I propped my feet on the desk and pulled out a paperback Stephen King novel I had brought to pass the time. Keep in mind, this was 2003, before smartphones existed. I quickly became absorbed in the story of the Torrance family in the Overlook Hotel. Before I knew it, my watch read 9 p.m. I put the book down, grabbed my flashlight, and headed out for another patrol. By this time, it was nearly pitch dark, and I could hear the sound of crickets chirping. I strolled through the cemetery, once again starting at the front and circling to the back, carefully shining my flashlight around. I had just reached the far end of the cemetery when something happened. I stopped, listening, and suddenly felt on edge. I heard something, a faint, slow, and steady scratching noise. I tilted my head, straining to pinpoint the source. I swept my flashlight across the area, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. I shrugged it off, assuming it was some kind of animal, a raccoon or maybe a possum, climbing a nearby tree. After finishing my patrol, I returned to the shed and resumed reading. I spent nearly half an hour engrossed in the book, just getting to the part where young Danny encounters the decaying naked woman in the bathtub, when I was jolted by a sound outside. It was footsteps, slow, heavy, uneven footsteps, circling the shed. My heart began pounding. I froze, paralyzed by sudden fear. By now, it was fully dark, and the cemetery gates were closed. There shouldn't be anyone out here. I remembered the caretaker mentioning kids sometimes sneaked in, but this sounded different. My pulse quickened as I strained to listen. The footsteps seemed to circle the shed too, maybe 3 times before gradually fading away into the distance. Silence returned, but I stayed frozen, too terrified to investigate. I glanced at the steel cabinet holding the shotgun, but remembered the caretaker's stern warning not to touch it unless my life was in danger. Maybe it was just some kids sneaking in for a thrill, or a couple looking for a private spot. But then again, this cemetery was 5 miles from town, and I hadn't heard any car approach or leave. I stood there for another 5 minutes, scared and indecisive. Finally, I told myself I was being a coward and needed to toughen up. Protecting the cemetery from intruders was my job, after all. Maybe it was just a harmless drunk or a homeless person looking for a place to sleep. Summoning my courage, I grabbed the flashlight and opened the door to step outside. The night was completely dark now, with thick clouds obscuring the moon. My flashlight was the only source of light as I cautiously began another patrol around the cemetery. There were no signs of trespassers, no broken locks or gates, and nothing out of place. But something still felt off. It took me a moment to realize what it was. The silence. The crickets had stopped chirping. An oppressive stillness had settled over the cemetery, like a blanket smothering all sound. The only noise was my own breathing. Other than that, the silence was absolute. It was the kind of silence that could suffocate you. It was terrifying. I felt as though I was being watched. I'd read that cliched description in countless horror stories and never believed it to be real, until now. In that moment, alone at night in the unnatural silence of the cemetery, I believed it. It felt like a dozen predatory eyes were locked onto me, studying my every move with such intensity it was almost physical. I was terrified, frozen in place. I stopped abruptly in my patrol, sensing and tilting my head. Then I heard it, something faint but distinct. What was that? I strained to listen carefully. It was a soft, steady scratching sound. Looking around, I tried to pinpoint where it was coming from. It seemed to be ahead of me, to my right, and it grew louder as I approached. The sound was coming from the new section of the cemetery, the part still in use. I stopped in front of a grave, the source of the noise. Shining my flashlight on the granite headstone, I saw that it belonged to an elderly woman who had been buried just weeks ago. The soil in front of the headstone was still brown and bare, with only sparse grass starting to grow. I leaned in closer, listening carefully, and realized the sound was coming from beneath the ground, directly under the grave. A chilling sensation, like ice water, surged from my gut to my heart. I tried to reassure myself it was just a snake or some burrowing animal moving through the earth. And then, something happened. I felt a vibration and heard the sound of dirt shifting. An earthquake. The thought crossed my mind, but the disturbance seemed localized, emanating solely from the grave in front of me. Then, the rectangular section of dirt above the grave began to sink. Slowly but unmistakably, as if the roof of an elevator was descending down its shaft. The entire process took no more than 5 seconds. I stood there, frozen in shock, staring at the newly formed pit, a deep, dark hollow. It took a moment for my brain to process what I was seeing. My panicked mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey. Despite my fear, a part of me was inexplicably curious, wanting to know more. Almost involuntarily, I stepped closer to the edge of the sunken grave and aimed my flashlight down. The beam illuminated the center of the grave, revealing a coffin lying at an awkward angle at the bottom of a pit, at least 15 feet deep, far deeper than a standard burial site. It looked more like a mineshaft than a grave, with loose dirt scattered around. As I stared at the coffin, it began to move. It slid slowly downward, inch by inch, scraping against the dirt. I swept my flashlight to the foot of the coffin, and what I saw still haunts my dreams to this day. There, at the bottom of the pit, was a hole, a dark, gaping entrance to a tunnel. Emerging from the hole were 2 long, thin, gray arms with unnaturally long fingers, each tipped with black, claw-like nails. The arms reached out, gripping the end of the coffin and dragging it, inch by agonizing inch, into the tunnel. That was when I turned and ran. I sprinted back to the shed, gasping for air, consumed by sheer terror. My hands fumbled in my pockets for my phone to call the police, but it wasn't there. I must have left it on the desk in the shed. When I reached the shed and stepped inside, I froze in shock. Everything was in complete disarray. The place had been ransacked. Tools were scattered across the floor. The table and chairs were overturned. My book was ripped to shreds, and my phone lay smashed to pieces on the ground. Someone or something had been inside while I was gone. As I stood there, trying to process the destruction, I heard it again, the sound of footsteps. Slow, heavy, uneven steps. I turned, my blood running cold. Standing just outside the doorway, mere steps away, was a figure, a shadow. Though it was only an outline, I could tell it was tall and gaunt, with unnaturally long, thin arms that nearly reached the ground. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness, like embers, and they were fixed intently on me. We stood there, locked in a silent standoff, as time seemed to stretch into eternity. Then the figure took a step toward the door. I lunged forward, slamming the door shut and locking it. A shrill, inhuman screech pierced the night, sounding more animal than human. The creature began pounding violently on the door, desperate to get in. A moment later, I heard a thud against the back wall of the shed. Then came the sound of claws scratching at the wood, as if something was trying to dig its way in. Another thud on the side wall. There were more of them now, and they were surrounding the shed, all trying to break in. That was when I remembered the shotgun. I looked toward the steel cabinet. It was still there but had been knocked onto its side during the chaos. Panic surged through me as I searched my pockets for the key the caretaker had given me. My trembling fingers finally found it, and I managed to unlock the cabinet and grab the shotgun, praying it was loaded. I had never touched a gun in my life and had no idea how to load it. With no time to waste, I fumbled with it for a few seconds before figuring out how to disengage the safety. The pounding on the door intensified, accompanied by unearthly screeches. It sounded like the small shed was under siege from every direction. I pumped the shotgun, mimicking what I'd seen in movies, and with shaky hands, aimed it at the door. Clenching my teeth, I pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening, far louder than I had anticipated. and the recoil was so powerful it nearly knocked me over. The next morning, I found a bruise on my right shoulder where the gun stock had struck me. A large hole, the size of a fist, appeared in the door just moments after I pulled the trigger. I thought I heard a pained screech from outside, and then nothing. For several seconds, I couldn't hear anything but the ringing in my ears. I even feared I had gone deaf from the gunshot. Gradually, my hearing returned. I knew because I could hear my own ragged breathing. Otherwise, it was silent. The banging and screeching were gone. I listened intently, my heart pounding, but there was nothing. Carefully, still gripping the gun tightly, I stepped toward the battered warehouse door, unlocked it, and swung it open. I raised the shotgun, ready for anything, but there was nothing, just the quiet of the night. Without wasting another second, I ran. Sprinting to my car, I jumped inside, locked all the doors, started the engine, and floored it. Gravel scattered and wheels screeched as I sped away. I blasted through the cemetery gates and onto the highway, driving as fast as I could toward home. But just as I exited the cemetery gates, I saw, or thought I saw, something in my rearview mirror. Countless glowing red eyes stared back at me from the darkness. My phone was destroyed, so I drove straight to the local police station once I reached town and reported that I had been attacked by grave robbers. Though I was frantic, I still had enough presence of mind to know they wouldn't believe me if I told them what I had really encountered at the cemetery. After giving my statement, they called my parents to pick me up, as I was clearly still shaken. My mother drove me home, with my father following in their car. When I finally got home, I went straight to my room and collapsed onto the bed, but it took hours before I could fall asleep. The next day, state police came to ask more questions. I repeated the story I had told the sheriff and his officers, that while patrolling the cemetery, I was ambushed by grave robbers who chased me back to the warehouse and tried to break in before I used the shotgun to scare them away. I claimed I hadn't gotten a good look at their faces and didn't know how many there were. The officers seemed unconvinced, as though they sensed I was holding something back. But they didn't press further and left soon after. 2 days later, Doc came to check on me. I assured him I was fine, but after what had happened, I wouldn't be returning to work at the cemetery. He seemed understanding and expressed regret over what I had gone through. He handed me $60 in cash for that ill-fated shift. I noticed, however, that Doc seemed uneasy, worried, even scared. His face bore an expression of concern and anxiety. I asked him about the police investigation at the cemetery and if they had found any clues. He shrugged and said there was no news yet. Somehow I could tell he was lying. His answer felt evasive, and I sensed he knew more than he was letting on. Doc left soon after, and that was the last time I ever spoke to him. It took nearly a week for me to recover from the trauma, but gradually, I resumed my normal life. I took a part-time job at Blockbuster Video for the rest of the summer, then started college in the fall. After graduating in 2007, I found a job in the city, moved into a decent apartment, got married, and had 2 kids. It's been 18 years since that night, and I've mostly left it behind, except for the occasional nightmare. But then, last month, something happened. My family and I visited my hometown to spend the weekend with my parents. While grocery shopping, I ran into Brian, Doc's son. He recognized me right away. Though we had never been close, we'd gone to the same school and shared mutual friends. He invited me to grab a beer and catch up, so I agreed. Over drinks, we talked about our lives. Brian told me Doc had passed away peacefully in his sleep 8 years ago. Brian now worked at the cemetery, following in his father's footsteps. I hesitantly asked if the police had ever found any leads about who had desecrated the grave and attacked me that night. Brian's expression immediately darkened. He became cautious, his demeanor tense. For a moment, he seemed to wrestle internally with whether or not to tell me something. Finally, he leaned in and asked me to promise not to tell anyone what he was about to share. Promised. Brian revealed that the police had investigated the collapsed grave and found a tunnel at the bottom of the pit. They followed it and discovered an extensive network of hand-dug tunnels beneath the cemetery. Another tunnel entrance was hidden beneath thick underbrush at the base of a hill behind the cemetery. At the center of this network was a cavern filled with shattered coffins. some over a century old, along with bones and body parts. Some of the remains were disturbingly fresh. The human body parts bore signs of having been eaten. I felt a chill run down my spine. Brian took a sip of his beer with a trembling hand and set the bottle down. He continued, explaining that after the horrifying discovery, the police had contacted the FBI, who arrived to take over the investigation. Not long after, another government agency showed up. When I asked who they were, he simply shook his head and said they never disclosed their identity. All Brian knew was that their authority surpassed even the state police and the FBI. This shadowy organization assumed control of the investigation, shut down the cemetery, and ordered everyone involved, including Doc, to remain silent. They backed their demands with threats of imprisonment or worse. The cemetery remained closed for over a year. During that time, men in hazmat suits collected remains, sealed them in black plastic bags, and loaded them into unmarked black vans. Everything was done under the cover of darkness, leaving no trace behind. The tunnel system was filled in with dirt, and eventually things returned to normal, or at least appeared to. Brian sat silently for a moment, and I thought his story was over. But then he added one more detail. The morning after my shift at the cemetery, before the full-scale investigation began, the sheriff was surveying the area. As he did, Brian and his father found something outside the warehouse, something the sheriff had overlooked. A puddle of black liquid stained the ground near the door I had fired at. Doc assumed it was just spilled engine oil from one of the cans in the warehouse and told Brian to clean it up. But Brian noticed something his father hadn't. A trail of the same liquid, leading from the warehouse door through the grass and toward the hill behind the cemetery. Curious, Brian discreetly collected a small sample of the substance in a vial when his father wasn't looking. He mailed it to a cousin who worked as a lab technician in the anthropology department of a university on the other side of the country. A few weeks later, Brian received a call from his cousin. They had analyzed the sample and confirmed it was blood. However, the DNA was unlike anything they had ever encountered. They couldn't trace its origin, but one thing was certain: whatever it came from, it wasn't human. "And that's it, man," Brian concluded, his voice low and heavy. "That's all I know." I sat there in stunned silence, my mind racing with everything Brian had just told me. It felt like a nightmare I'd never fully woken from. Author's note: if this story gave you chills, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below. Thanks for reading, and stay tuned for even more spine-tingling tales.